Today is Monday, June the 6th, and this is a re-recording of the webinar, Intersectionality, Identity, and Accessibility, Moving Forward Together. This was presented on Wednesday, June the 1st in live format as part of the Town of Whitby's Diversity and Inclusion webinar series. I'm Shauna Moore, and I am the facilitator. Our learning goals for the webinar are to understand the role that social identity, power, and privilege plays in marginalization and oppression, to discuss the concept of intersectionality, and to apply the understanding of identity, power, and privilege and intersectionality to inclusive practice. A land acknowledgement was read at the beginning of the webinar on June 1st. I would like to add to that webinar, land acknowledgement and remind us that it's National Indigenous History Month, and that as someone who was not born on this land, I am grateful for the opportunity to live on these lands, and it reminds me of all of the unlearning that I need to do about Indigenous history. Let's start with social identity. If we take a look at the identity wheel, we can see that there are a number of parts of that identity wheel that make up who we are. So it includes our gender identity, our age, our ability, our education, our national origin. All of these things make up who we are. As you can see, we are not one thing. Our identity is layered, and there are a number of pieces that make up our identity. A personal example is I show up as an Indo-Caribbean woman who was not born on these lands. I am cisgender, I am able-bodied, to name a few parts of my identity. Some of those parts have afforded me privilege, and I experienced oppression as a result of some of the parts of my identity. Our identity is not static, and it's important to remember that there are spaces where you might have power and privilege, and there are spaces where you may not have power and privilege. So let's think about ourselves, and let's shift the thinking to someone else who we may work with, who may volunteer with, who we might be learning with. And how does this impact the way they engage in a space? So think about, who am I? How do I show up? Who are the identities around me? How do they show up? Social identity is experienced differently in different settings. How do I see myself, and how do others see me? It's important when we do this work that we talk about privilege. And I have chosen a privilege wheel from the Canadian Council of Refugees. You will find a number of wheels that represent power and privilege and how they work. I have chosen this particular one for this webinar. As you can see, that there are parts of an identity on the outer part of that circle. And you will see that privilege is in the middle of this circle. And you can see what some of the qualities or aspects or identities that afford individuals privilege. So let's start with the definition. Privilege refers to unearned access to resources and social power that are only available to some as a result of their advantaged social group membership. So if we look at language, for example, I am not so privileged in this current context if I speak other languages. I'm a little closer to privilege if I'm French speaking in Canada, and even closer if I'm English speaking. If I look at ability, Living with disability sort of puts me on the outer part of that circle. Having health issues, but not a disability, perhaps a little closer. And if I'm healthy and able bodied, look how close it places me to privilege. It's important for us to understand that when we are talking about privilege and doing this work, the goal of this work is not to shame those who have privilege, but it's to help us to all understand how it works so that we can move towards more positive outcomes for everyone. So as we start to talk about power and privilege, access to power and privilege impacts our lived experience. The same is true if we have a lack of power and privilege. Awareness of power and privilege helps us to understand how we show up and experience the world and environment, our workplaces, our places of worship, the places of learning. And it also helps us to understand how others show up. This stems from our identity and reminds us of how we and other people around us will show up in an environment. Consider someone with a disability or a transgender individual or someone who is unsheltered. How might they show up? What is their access or lack of access to privilege? Here is yet another spectrum of power and privilege to illustrate how oppression works. So below that line, we see where individuals with certain identities might face oppression and can face oppression and do face oppression. And above that line, that spectrum of privilege. Oppression is defined as a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on social group membership, and it can operate intentionally and unintentionally on individual, institutional, and cultural levels. So, excuse me, individuals, a person's beliefs and actions that serve to perpetuate oppression. Interpersonal, our interactions between people, both within and across difference. And systemic, where there happens to be institutional oppression. It's hard for us to admit, but we need to acknowledge that many of our Canadian systems are built for the privileged and perpetuate oppression. Marginalization occurs when a person or groups of people are less able to do things or access basic services or opportunities. And this is tied to our identity. So let's look at some of the synonyms there for marginalization. It could be as strong as ostracism or banishment, or it could be disregarded, sidelining, freezing out someone, being relegated to the margins. Think about some marginalized groups in our society and what their experiences might be. Let's dive into intersectionality. So what is intersectionality? It is the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, and gender, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So let's hark back to the diversity wheel and think about those dimensions of identity. This is based on the work of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the phrase in the 1980s. And it is a way of looking at individuals as a result of the sum of the parts of their identity. Intersectionality is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression, And we must consider everything and anything that can marginalize people, gender, race, class, sexual orientation, physical ability, etc. Here's a quote: "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives." This is a quote by Audre Lorde, an author, feminist, and civil rights activist. So let's understand that each part of a person's identity is connected to the other parts. We can't split out part of our identity and leave parts at the door. We don't show up as one part of our identity. We are the whole. We need to recognize how a person and people may experience multiple overlapping systems of oppression as a result of their identities. The overlapping experiences create a unique lived experience for this person or persons with similar identities. Intersectionality is a lens, then, through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is acknowledged that everyone has their experiences of discrimination and privilege. Dr. Crenshaw looked at the unique oppression faced by Black women seeking employment from an organization. The organization had policies and practices that offered women jobs and very progressive practices and policies. They also had progressive practices and policies to open the door for Black men to attain jobs. However, Black women faced barriers to employment. And there we find the intersection of race and gender. If we don't have an intersectional approach, we are leaving out and marginalizing certain identities. Here is just another view of intersecting oppressions. And if we look at that figure in the middle of that Venn diagram on the left, we can see where that person is uniquely placed. Let's consider some identities. A woman who is Muslim, a transgender man who has physical disabilities, a racialized man who is supported by social welfare, a new Canadian living with mental illness. Does one come before the other? How do I look at these individuals? Does one part of that identity deserve more attention than another? How do we address this complex issue? Let's unpack each of these. So a woman faces institutional oppression in some cases, and we also know that Islamophobia exists. So that woman not only faces oppression because of gender, but because of her religious identity. A transgender man who faces barriers and oppression because of their identity of being transgender also faces oppression and barriers because of physical disabilities. So when we think about those, we cannot separate them. That is how these individuals show up in a space. So we need to unpack them and look at the whole person. Here is that diagram again. And this cartoon reminds us that one size does not fit all. It is not a one size fits all approach. We need to be focused on and aware of capturing uniqueness. Understanding intersectionality is recognizing that we do not live single issue lives. Identities are inextricably linked. Individuals experience harassment, discrimination, and oppression as a result of multiple parts of their identities. It critically examines parts of identity like gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, religion, age, nationality, and other aspects of identity interact on multiple and concurrent levels in a person's lived experience. So, how do we start to address this? It starts with recognizing unique identities. And within those identities, experiences may be varied. Am I giving individuals the opportunity to identify themselves and their unique identities? It also involves knowing who is in the room in the organization. How do we best capture this so we know who's in the room, who's in our organization, who's in our learning space? And we need to give opportunity for individuals to safely identify. While so much of this work is qualitative, we must understand the importance of quantitative information as well. Culture. What kind of culture am I creating? Is it safe? Can the whole person show up? Physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally? It involves continuous learning on each of our parts, expanding our circles, understanding different identities and lived experiences, educating people leaders, policymakers, and everyone so that they start to understand the impact this has on individuals and how they engage in a space or an organization. And seeking out the presence of difference, not only in the visible realm, but ability, thought, ways of being, ways of doing, ways of believing, ways of expressing oneself. Moving towards accessibility and inclusion, how do we do that? The practical ways that we can do that is acknowledging that discrimination and oppression are layered. We can't look at just one oppression. Recognize that individuals' lived experiences are unique. If I go back to some of the identities we talked about, a Muslim woman may not have the same experience as another Muslim woman because they have both had unique lived experiences. Engaging with and listening to and amplifying marginalized voices, stories, and lived experiences, giving up my seat at the table, making space. Consider the role that language plays when we are writing communications, policies, and all the rest of it. Accepting that one size does not fit all, and work to understand how issues intersect with each other. Building policies and practices and a sense of community with diverse groups. Co-leading, co-facilitating, consultative. So last week, when we held this webinar, it was National Accessibility Week. And the theme for last week was inclusive from the start. We had sort of a blend of two themes. So we used last year's theme in the title, and we moved towards inclusion from the start. So how are we inclusive and how do we look at accessibility? Let's broaden our definition and to include not just the ease of access, obtainable, reachable, and attainable spaces, but let's include to be heard, understood, appreciated. Let's think of being adaptable so that it's able to be used in multiple ways. It is universal. And that could not just be a space, but our policies, the way we do things, the way we communicate. And consider that identities and lived experiences are unique and multi-layered. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how does this inform my policies, my practice, and the culture that I am building? When I look at this cartoon, which has showed up in a number of places, here is a well-intended circle. Happy, well-intended, happy, welcoming, and they're saying on the other side of this wall, if you want to make it through, just be yourself. We have a glimpse on the other side of that wall where we see there are people lined up, different shapes, different colors lined up, but they just can't get through that circle. That pink circle, holding a lot of privilege, was able to get through that wall. And again, I believe well-intended, very happy, welcoming. When we take a glimpse on the other side of that wall, we see that there's different shapes and colors. Not only are they different shapes, but they're different colors as well, different expressions. I don't know what you guys are complaining about, says the circle on the other side. Just come on in. Let's think about, when we think about accessibility, inclusion from the start, let's think about what this cartoon says to us. I would like to thank the town of Whitby for the opportunity to present this webinar, with a special thank you to the Diversity Advisory Committee, as well as the Accessibility Committee. Thank you very much.